The Denver Broncos have a handful of young undrafted wide receivers who are making plays at training camp, but the depth at the position might keep them off the active roster. We'll talk about that and much more here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Broncos Country, what's happening? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everyone in Broncos Country, all the everydayers out there. Thanks for tuning in, making us your first listen, however you choose to do so. And just so you never miss out on all your Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more every single day, all year long, become an everydayer. If you're not one already, hit that subscribe or that follow button wherever you get your podcast or on YouTube. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined as always by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. And here's what we're going to break down for you on today's episode of the show. A little bit of a little preview before today's morning practice in Broncos Country for training camp. We'll go through the undrafted rookie wide receivers that are making plays so far throughout practice, but Denver's depth of position might keep them off the active roster. We'll go into who's making the greatest case for themselves. Plus, we'll go through several players who are having quiet training camps, and we'll analyze whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And then we'll highlight what we want to see from the Broncos this week in joint practices with the 49ers and why it's time to dominate San Francisco. We get all that on today's episode of the show. Sayre, let's start off with focusing here on the undrafted rookie free agent wide receivers. The Broncos, they have a handful of guys in at camp this year, and I feel like there's several that are just making consistent plays on a day-to-day basis, and they all have different skill sets. You talk about size, you talk about speed, you talk about downfield threat ability. Broncos are seeing a little bit of everything, but the depth at the position might be a problem.
100%. When you have a wide receiver group that is at least 6 deep right now, Cody, I think arguably, 7, depending on what your thoughts are on A.T. Perry, because he's played in the NFL and played at a pretty high level. Obviously, he hasn't been out there at practice yet, but there's a couple guys that are obviously going to be fighting for practice squad spots, and it feels like they're only fighting for practice squad spots at this point, but you just never know when training camp and preseason games are going to change the narrative for guys like Jerjuan Newton, Courtney Jackson, Joaquin Davis, even Cyrese Rowan, who was a tryout player that was signed by the Broncos. So a number of guys there at the receiver position was really the only position too in undrafted free agency other than the offensive line where the Broncos signed actually a handful of players. And this is where you always have a deep group going into training camp. You always have a bunch of guys out there getting reps, but it's one of those positions where I feel like you've seen guys develop in Denver and under a number of different coaching staffs. So for somebody like Sean Payton and for his coaching staff, you feel like these guys have a real opportunity to go in there and grow for a year. It just feels, though, more so like these guys are poised or destined to redshirt after training camp no matter what.
And that's the challenging part about it, because I've liked what I've seen from Joaquin Davis, Jerjuan Newton. Courtney Jackson's had a couple of big plays here and there. Cyrese Rowan, he's so fast. I feel like all of these guys, if you really want to get them onto your practice squad, I feel like they'd be welcome additions. I feel like they would challenge and make you better on a week-to-week basis. When you talk about the scout team here, just where Denver's at right now with Cortland Sutton, Marvin Mims, Devon Vele, Troy Franklin, Trent Sherfield, and Pat Bryant, that's the wide receiver room. That's going to be the guys that go into the regular season on the 53-man roster. A.T. Perry is another name that you mentioned there. But if we're looking at the practice squad, it could be entirely revamped. I think A.T. Perry will stay along here for Denver. I know he's working his way back from an injury, but you and I were talking about it in yesterday's episode of the show where we were kind of recapping Saturday's scrimmage, and we were talking about Jerjuan Newton. And Sayre, I feel like with Newton, the one thing that I see with him, Michael Bandy's been on the practice squad for the last handful of years, had a really good gig behind the scenes for Denver. This could be the type of player I think that could upend him in terms of getting a practice squad spot, because look, you don't want to have every single spot. You get 16 of them. You don't want every spot dedicated to a wide receiver. You need to balance it out with offensive linemen, maybe some guys in the secondary, definitely some linebacker depth there. To me, this could be something to monitor here if he has a strong preseason. Newton potentially upending Michael Bandy. But then again, Michael Bandy could go out there and have a fantastic preseason, which could also change that narrative. but Newton has the upside, in my opinion, right now to be a potential player down the line, maybe 2 to 3 years if his path goes according to plan. And then Joaquin Davis, I felt like has made several impressive contested catches throughout training camp that has stood out to me as not only do you get a guy who's got a big body, good hands, high athletic catch point, but you have a guy who can also box out smaller defenders there and make plays in tight windows. So the Broncos, I think, have a luxury of options right now of just being able to say, hey, we can sit back here in the preseason. We can watch these guys play. We're going to use the body of work in training camp, but we're also going to look at how they play in the games. And it's going to allow us to maybe look ahead to the future a little bit at the depth of the position, because if there's ever an injury, can one of these guys play and offer you value in the regular season? Hard to say right now, but upside-wise, definitely might have the opportunity over a guy like Michael Bandy.
And these guys are all deep sleepers too, right? When you talk about investments being made in undrafted free agent players, like nobody at this wide receiver position who's been making plays during camp got more than $50,000 in guaranteed money. And the guy who got $50,000 was Courtney Jackson. Beneath him, Joaquin Davis at $15,000, and then below him even was Jerjuan Newton at $10,000. Kyrese Rowan obviously was a tryout player. So interestingly enough, we always talk about with undrafted free agents how much money talks in terms of where the Broncos, hey, they want to get this guy to the practice squad. They gave him $100K guaranteed or $150K or $200. I mean, that's how high some of the numbers are getting for their coveted undrafted players. These guys are the deepest of sleepers, right? You've got 50,000 and below, and you've got a tryout player out there. I feel like ultimately the Broncos undrafted free agent streak is probably in serious jeopardy this year. But number two, you almost feel like because of the roster situation, if one of these guys works out and practices well against the 49ers or plays really well in the preseason games, whatever the case may be, it does feel like they have a pretty decent shot of getting poached away, right? And the Broncos kind of missing out on all of these guys and having a chance to say, hey, you know, this was a year where we felt really good about our receiver position. We brought in a number of guys to take some shots as undrafted free agents, and they ended up practicing well. We just didn't have a spot for them, and they ended up succeeding elsewhere.
Well, I know San Francisco is banged up with some injuries at wide receiver right now. I know Ricky Pearsall's on that list. I still think Brandon Ayuk is working his way back on, from certain ailments. So it's very much an opportunity. And look, the Broncos capitalized years back in a joint practice with San Francisco by recognizing Tim Patrick and was able to say, hey, you know what? Tim Patrick is a guy who stood out a little bit, ended up with the Denver Broncos during that standpoint there, and obviously became a key player for them. And also as well to that scenario that you mentioned about maybe getting poached away a little bit. Remember the preseason game just a few years ago, 2023, the Broncos were on the road playing at San Francisco. And who was the key standout to where Sean Payton himself has recently acknowledged there was no way after that we were going to sneak this guy into the practice squad?
Jaleel, right? That's the game
Yeah.
that Jaleel McLaughlin yeah, absolutely. And Sean references that often because you get a guy that plays that well in the preseason, put it on tape against another defense. It doesn't matter if it's preseason or if it's backup players or what have you. If you put that stuff on tape, other NFL teams are going to be like, that guy might be able to fit what we're doing, or we might try to give him a recruiting pitch to get him out of there, because you can't protect these guys if you put them on waivers. I mean, that's the reality. So for the Denver Broncos, it's an interesting scenario to where you don't want to force the undrafted streak to continue. I know it's not like a 25-year streak. I know there's been a couple of years here and there where they didn't have somebody, but it's a pretty long-standing thing for both them and Sean Payton, isn't it, to have an undrafted guy make the roster? It just doesn't feel like it's trending toward that this year.
Well, and it's not necessarily a bad thing when you consider where Denver's roster is at, the depth, building through the draft, signing key guys in free agency, other guys getting second contracts. I think that the Broncos are in a spot right now where, hey, you don't have to rely necessarily on undrafted guys. Now, it's always cool when you have a guy who's, got a story where he's coming from a small school, or, there was something that happened. He's got just odds are against him. Undrafted guy comes in and you have the next Chris Harris Jr. I mean, that stuff, I live for that. You and I love that stuff. I know Broncos fans love that as well, but this year might be the year it actually is in jeopardy. It's going to be hard with all the depth the Broncos currently have right now here. But Broncos Country, our conversation is going to continue here on today's episode of the show. There's some players who are being talked about daily at training camp. There's also some players you're not hearing a lot about. There's some quietness to some players, and that might not necessarily be a bad thing. We'll tell you about that much more on today's episode of the show. Today's Locked On Broncos podcast is brought to you by friends over there at 5 Hour Energy Transfusion. It's time to fuel up and turn it up. And 5 Hour Energy Transfusion brings the bold grape, ginger, and lime flavor of your favorite golf drink minus the alcohol into a quick and energizing shot. So whether you're sinking birdies or just making memories with your friends, this one's a hole-in-one for your energy game. And let's be honest, some days on the course or off it, you just need that extra boost to stay sharp and energized.
Cody, back when I was playing golf almost every day in the summers with my friends, we used to bet on, hey, if you lose this round, you are paying for lunch for everybody, right? And you didn't want to be the kid, the high school kid that was paying lunch for everybody. Golf is all about those good times with good people and good flavors, of course. And the grape, ginger, lime flavor from 5 Hour Energy gives you the best parts of your clubhouse go-to. If you go to 5hourenergy.com today, that is the number 5hourenergy.com. You can use our promo code LOCKEDONGolf to receive 20% off your first order. This offer is only valid until September 30th on one order and cannot be used with other promotions. The code is not good on subscription orders. Whether you're meeting up with friends or trying to turn 18 holes into 36, get the energizing boost you need to power through. Order transfusion flavored 5 Hour Energy shots today. You want to be stacking days at this point in training camp. You don't want to be struggling to stand out. Unfortunately, that is the reality for a number of Denver Broncos players, but it's still early on in the process, Broncos country. There's plenty of time for these guys to turn things around, start gaining some hype, generating attention out there at practice and in the preseason games. Of course, we'll tell you all about some players who kind of need to step up their game a little bit here as we get into the second full week of Denver Broncos training camp. But Broncos country, we appreciate you so much for tuning in, rocking with us every day. Hit subscribe if you haven't already done so, wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as on YouTube, and join the discussion there because a lot of great conversation happening on YouTube as well. Cody, let's talk about the players who need to step up, players struggling to stand out, right? That's the thing at training camp nowadays. It is hard to get eyes on 90 guys, but ultimately you got to make plays. You got to be the one to stand out. You got to start stacking days. Who do you feel like right now is maybe struggling to stand out in your opinion? And then why would you say it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world?
Well, I mean, it's always tough because when you have a 90-man roster and you have various position battles or you have competition for back-end spots for depth, I mean, you're looking for people to make plays almost every day in practice. I would kind of say there are some players who are struggling, and we'll highlight that. But I think that there are players who have in quiet training camps. And I think sometimes, and I've had a lot of fans ask me questions on social media about this. You know, they'll ask me about RJ Harvey or Jahdae Barron. I've had a ton of questions about Jahdae Barron and whether or not, you know, what's going on with him. We're not hearing his name talked about as much. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, right? I think sometimes quiet is good because it means that this player is going through the process and learning. Now, let's mention, you know, a couple of guys here. I think we could bring up both Barron and Joaquin McMillian as those guys are getting reps inside the nickel here for the Broncos. We're not hearing a lot about J-Mac. We're not hearing necessarily a lot of Barron's name being called here, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. That doesn't mean they're having bad training camps. I think that these guys are kind of just locked into this battle right now for reps and for opportunities there. But primarily with the way that the Broncos offense has been testing this position group specifically, they've been kind of going to the outside a little bit. They go into the middle of the field where they're trying to test the linebackers and the safeties. Like you're seeing good battles back and forth. I still think that J-Mac and Barron are having solid camps, right? And really, I think right now we're not going to hear or see any progression from these guys unless they make a big play. I think it's one of those positions you play in training camp where you don't really hear the nickel position or production at the nickel being highlighted as much. I know, especially with J-Mac in the last handful of years, we haven't heard that except when he was an undrafted guy playing on the outside. So nothing really concerning to look at there. I think we'll see them probably get more opportunities to shine in the preseason. But the fact that their names aren't being called isn't necessarily a bad thing. And even RJ Harvey, I've had fans ask me, I don't know what it's like for you on social media. You can tell me, but have you had fans asking you about whether, you know, what's going on with RJ Harvey? You know, we're not hearing his name talked about almost every day. Like we're not hearing that he's him. Those are things that I'm hearing.
Yeah, you know, I think that there is some of that. I see a lot more stuff from fantasy people who are taking the best clips from RJ Harvey and are kind of over like analyzing that and being like, oh my gosh, this guy is the next Alvin Kamara, you know. So I've seen the other extreme of that from people who are non-Broncos people, which is very interesting. I think so many people want RJ Harvey to be this guy right away. And that's a little unfair to heap on him at this point, especially with the depth in the backfield right now. But I do think that when you look at the secondary as well, Cody, like a JL Skinner to me hasn't stood out. I feel like
Yeah.
he's been one of those guys that you want to hear about guys making plays, or at least if you're not hearing about them making plays out there, you want to hear about them getting strong opportunities or rotating in with the top unit. Because if nothing else, if they're rotating in with the top unit, it likely means that the coaches like them, or that the front office likes them. But unfortunately, like, we're not hearing stuff about JL Skinner at all running with the first team defense, and I know that the Broncos have their safety duo set. I'm not saying he should be starting out there, but I know I've seen PJ Locke, he's rotated in with the top defense, and as he should be. He was a starter the last 2 years, but a guy like JL Skinner, I mean, with Sam Franklin coming in, Devin Key playing last year, I mean, now I start to wonder, is he kind of on the roster bubble?
Yeah, I don't know if he's on the bubble or not. It's hard to say. I don't think he is, just because he is one of their best special teams players. He's their core 4 returner from last year. He'll have a spot on the roster because of special teams, unless there's something drastic that changes. But primarily, I agree with you. In the first week of just practice with pads and just the full physical intensity, I haven't seen a lot of JL working with the second team defense. I've seen him getting kind of those back end reps there, with the third team defense. And I'm not sure if that's like an indictment or if that's just, hey, the way the reps are playing out, but it has been primarily the first team defense, Brandon Jones, Talanoa Hufanga, and really it's PJ Locke and Devin Key getting those next primary reps there. And Sam Franklin, I think, has been rotating in with Key alongside with PJ Locke with that second team defense, probably more so. Is it much to read into right now? I don't know. I think it's too early for us to do that, but it is certainly interesting considering this offseason. There was a lot of noise and there was a lot of conversation about the Broncos wanting to see JL take the next step. Is this by design, or are they just waiting to unleash him a little bit in the preseason? I think really that we're going to find out, I think, after the first 2 preseason games, really how the safety room is kind of shaping out. But I think JL is a fair name to kind of throw into that. We talked about players who are struggling, Sayre. I think the one guy who I hate to sound like I'm piling on this guy, Joe Machowski, the third team center for the Broncos, has had a rough training camp. I mean, there's times where Sam Ehlinger has consistently had to adjust to the right, to the left, low, and even there was a pass during Saturday's training camp scrimmage. The pass went over his head. It was rough, and it's like you're not giving Sam a really good opportunity to mix and match and work. So that's going to be something to monitor this week as well. When we talk about guys who are struggling, I mean, realistically speaking, I don't think there's anybody who's really struggling in your primary first team offense, first team defense. You're seeing some ups and downs from the second team unit, but I think you are seeing guys with that third team unit. You are seeing some struggles there.
Yeah, which is to be expected to a degree, isn't it? With young guys or guys who are just getting acclimated to the NFL, undrafted players, bottom of the roster guys. It's a stark difference when you're talking about guys who have made Pro Bowls or guys who are aspiring to make Pro Bowls and guys who are just trying to make a roster. So we understand that aspect of it, but that kind of surprises me too I know we're not necessarily focusing on the third team O-line in this episode, Cody, but like a guy like Clay Webb, I mean, I haven't heard anything about him at all. And we thought he's one of the highest priced undrafted players. Sean Payton spoke about him in the offseason program. Like, I'm a little surprised he's not taking reps at center. I know he was a left guard at Jacksonville State, things like that. So maybe we'll see him cross train there, but he's another guy that hasn't stood out to me. And then I think at the running back position too, like, Tyler Bedinger what's he doing out there? Because Sean dropped his name a couple of days ago, and I haven't heard anything about him. I haven't heard that he's running with the starters, or hey, he had a really nice run here, or I haven't heard anything about Tyler Bedinger. I've heard almost every other running back has been mentioned so far.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's just because he's getting work with that third team offense, that third team offensive line that we were talking about, and they're trying to figure out who the depth is. But I think, guys like Blake Watson have made plays, J.K. Dobbins, R.J. Harvey, Jaleel McLaughlin. I mean, Bedinger, I feel like kind of has a little bit of an uphill climb, even though he's one of the more explosive guys that they have on the roster, Sayre. And look, last year we were pounding the table for Tyler Bedinger. But right now with the changes that they've made with bringing in Dobbins, with obviously drafting Harvey and still having Jaleel heavily in the mix, Blake Watson seems like a guy who's, can step up and maybe be a guy who play on the special teams. And then you have Audric Estime obviously still fighting and stacking some days. I don't know how this running back room is going to shape out behind obviously JK and RJ. I have my feeling it would be Jalil, but Audric has had I'd say an impressive training camp so far, which is big, and that's what you want to see. So who knows? We're fixing to find out. You got joint practice this week with the 49ers. You got a preseason game. Next week, you have a joint practice at home with Arizona before the Cardinals play in week 2. We're going to learn a lot about this Broncos team in the next 2 weeks, Sarah, and I'm excited to break it down here with everyone in Broncos Country here. But Broncos Country, it is practice week. It is game week. We're excited about that, and that means that it's time to dominate the 49ers. What do the Broncos have to do this week before they get to that joint practice and leading up to that first game? We'll share our thoughts on that and more on today's episode of the show. Broncos Country, today's episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at Game Time. And we've all been there, logging on early and waiting forever for concert tickets to go on sale, only to lose your spot for a show that you've been dying to see. Live music, it should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping. And that's where Game Time comes in, because Game Time, they make getting concert tickets faster and easier than ever, because prices actually drop as it gets closer to showtime. And you can save up to 60% off with their killer last-minute deals.
And if you've ever wondered about what your view would actually look like before you buy tickets, because that's always so important to me, especially when you're going to something that involves your favorite music artist, right? The Game Time app shows you a panoramic seat view, so there's no surprises. You're not going to be caught off guard by sitting behind the stage or not in a great spot to be able to hear from the speaker system. You can take the guesswork out of buying any concert tickets or show tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed.
With the Broncos approaching their joint training camp practice this week with San Francisco ahead of Saturday's preseason opener, what can the Broncos do this week on offense and defense to prepare themselves for that level of competition? What do we want to see, and how can Denver fix some of the issues they ran into early on here in camp? You're going to get all here on today's show. Just want to say thanks once again to everyone in Broncos Country. Thank you for tuning in, making us your first listen. Sayre, obviously, I think after the first week of pads, I think that's the most important, right? You have that first initial period of training camp that starts where it's helmets, jerseys, shorts, and you're trying to acclimate, you're trying to build up to that. I don't really evaluate too much of the non-padded practices here. I don't think there's really a lot you can tell from that. The pads is when the evaluation becomes a little more clear, I think, for the coaching staff. I think through the first week of practice, the one issue I think that we have seen, penalties so far have been a little bit of an issue, and I think some of that is all related to the new neutral zone rules, and that's something that Sean Payton has spent some time highlighting. But an issue the Broncos struggled with last year was penalties. That's something they've got to get out of the way. Is this the year that they finally become a less penalized team?
Got to be disciplined. Got to have the preparation to avoid that during the regular season, because obviously last year that was a huge reason why this team was near the top of the league in 3 and outs. It's a huge reason why this team was, they ranked 10th in scoring, but they could have easily been ranked a lot higher, because a lot of drives were killed by really untimely penalties, as if there's a good time for a penalty. Maybe when you're up by 2 touchdowns, that's a great time for a penalty there, late in a game when you're up by 2 scores. But I think, honestly, there's not a good time for a penalty, but there's also times that it's like torturous to everybody watching the game to think, oh my gosh, that just wiped off a huge play off the board. Or it starts, you already are struggling to get things going on early downs, and now it's 1st and 15 instead of 1st and 10, right? So it's just a tough deal that you have to be so careful when you get into the regular season not to get into a slump with it, because it kind of seemed like when it rained, it poured for the Denver Broncos. And ultimately, it's got to be fixed and it's got to be cleaned up. And having the offensive line back together for a second straight season, I would feel like that should help tremendously.
Yeah, and I don't think the penalty issues have really been on Denver's first team. They've had a couple, right? But it hasn't been to the extent of which we've seen from the second team offense, the third team offense. There's a lot of pre-snap penalties that have been happening with those units specifically. And I think where Sean Payton's frustration comes in is that when you talk about a pre-snap penalty, that has more so to do like with thinking. That's fixable. Like pre-snap penalties are entirely preventable. So a lot of it has to be communication based. Is the quarterback getting the cadence right in the huddle, right? Do they understand what the snap count is? Is it on 1? Is it on 2? Those things matter here. But if a player or if a unit continuously has these issues where you're having a false start or an illegal shift, that's something that can happen. That's just a focus thing. And that's something that Sean Payton and his staff really wants to kind of get out of the way. I think when you face a different look, which the Broncos are going to face a different look, this upcoming week, of course, Robert Saleh back in San Francisco, you're going to face Bosa. That's going to be a good challenge for this first team offense. And then, you got that 49ers offense. It's got Brock Purdy, but you got Christian McCaffrey fully healthy, ready to go. You've got Kittle at tight end, Jawan Jennings. Really, the Broncos defense has a good advantage this week, I feel like. But you cannot be penalized because that carries over into the games. I even remember in the preseason as well, since Sean Payton has taken over, I feel like penalties even have been amplified a lot more in these first 3 years here for Sean. Hopefully going into year 3, hopefully that's not the case here in this preseason because that did carry into the regular season last year.
It did, and you don't want that to be the case because a lot of times in the preseason, it's kind of easy to write it off and say, well, they're just trying to call it, really harshly at this time of year because they're trying to make a point, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that's really the case. I think ultimately they're going to call out. Remember in week 1 last year, I think it was the Baltimore Ravens were getting called for a penalty every other snap for their alignment on the offensive line, which was a huge point of discussion. So the NFL is not just going to call stuff in the preseason to kind of make an emphasis. They're obviously going to continue calling it in the regular season. So that's where the Broncos need to do well, especially against a different team, showing that discipline, making them make the unforced errors, right? And that's where I feel like you want to dominate these practices against the 49ers, Cody. You want to go out there, you want to make them look bad. You want to have Kyle Shanahan have some angry comments after practice about his team. Like, that's what we want to hear. We want to hear grumpy Kyle Shanahan. We want to hear the 49ers having to talk about why is this happening against the Broncos? What, all those sorts of things. You don't want it to be the opposite, right? You don't want the other side of that coin where you're the one having the grumpy press conference. You're the one having the issue with defending this guy or getting open against these guys. Like, they have a young defense. They have a lot of players injured. Go out there and dominate these practices.
Well, and so much of this week too, you're not really scouting San Francisco. You're not really going through the week of practice saying, hey, we're going to pull up 49ers film from last year. This is what we're going to prepare. I think a lot of it with these training camp practices is you're going into it raw and you're saying, hey, we're running our stuff. They're going to come out in that. If we stick to our foundational principles and we communicate, it doesn't matter what they come out in. We will adjust, obviously, as practice goes on, but we're not scouting these looks necessarily. We're not really scouting for a preseason game. You'll get their base principles and kind of how they run. And of course, I'm sure it helps that Talanoa Hufanga, DJ Jones is, I think, played for Robert Saleh before. And obviously you got Dre Greenlaw in the mix. Maybe they'll give some good intel this week. My question, one thing I want to see, obviously we want guys to stay healthy. We don't want to see guys banged up, but one of the questions I have is, will we see Dre Greenlaw come back this week? He is fine. He'll be fine, as Sean Payton has said, but will we see him practice against his former team? Or is it going to be a situation where we see him not practice this week, but play in Saturday's preseason game? Where do you stand? What would you prefer here when it comes to Dre Greenlaw this week?
Oh man, this is a rock and a hard place kind of deal because he does have to get out there. I mean, he's got to be on the field. And I think if he's able to get on the practice field, Cody, to me, that's a great sign that, okay, this was just a scare. We avoided anything serious and he's going to be fine. But ultimately, I guess I don't know. Does going right back out on the field make it worse? Or are they risking something by having him go out there and play in a game where it's really more so full speed than anything else? And maybe in practice, it's you take a little bit off. I don't know. But to me, I'll be, I guess, kind of walking on eggshells a little bit whenever he takes the field, regardless of whether it's in practice or in a preseason game. I feel like everybody in Broncos country is kind of just sitting on pins and needles with the whole Dre Greenlaw situation and feeling like at any point there could be bad news.
Well, I feel like this, and this is where I take comfort, and I think Broncos fans should take comfort in it. If he's back on the field, that means that he's passed every medical test. I feel like we're at this point now, even though you don't want these guys to go through and suffer another injury, I feel like the process that Bo Lowry and Sean Payton have kind of put in place with the training staff on the medical side of things if they're on the field, they're good to go, right? I don't think the Broncos are going to force a guy onto the field if he's not ready. They've never had this tendency to rush players back. They're going to be smart. They're going to treat, I think, Sean Payton has said it before. We're going to look at the symptoms of, where they're at and determine whether or not they can be back out there on the field. But if they're on the field, that means, hey, they got the green light, which I have trust in that.
Yeah, I do too. And I think that that's the thing that Sean Payton and his staff, they are not going to just throw guys out there and be reckless with it, right? They're going to be extremely cautious. Got one of the best training staffs, if not the best training staff in the NFL. And they're not just going to arbitrarily throw guys out there just to get them practice reps, because really, Dre Greenlaw, does he need those reps, Cody? I mean, yeah, you do need reps. You want to get chemistry with your guys. I'm not trying to diminish practice and how much it is important. But for somebody like Dre Greenlaw, like we talked about before, you want him getting to week 1 more than anything else. That's the thing. You want him to be playing games this season. You don't need to hammer the preseason stuff home. And I mean, get him reps, be cautious as you can, but certainly get him to week 1. That's the ultimate goal, I think, with a guy like Dre Greenlaw, because of the impact that he can make in this defense.
Everybody on the active roster, just get them healthy to week 1 when they take on the Tennessee Titans at home, and then we'll go from there here. But Broncos Country, that'll wrap up today's episode show. We appreciate you so much for rocking with us here once again. Don't forget, we got you covered every single day with content, news, breakdowns, everything that's going on, plus bonus episodes. And you're going to get a bonus episode here today. You want to know why? Because the Broncos, they practiced here this morning. I'm going to be there. Sayre and I, we're going to react to it and share the story of the day following Monday's Broncos practice. You can expect that and much more here on Locked On Broncos. We appreciate you. We'll see you soon.